The candles guttered in the damp Prague cellar, shadows stretching like broken limbs across the stone walls. On the table lay the still body of a rat, its fur stiff with death, yet its chest began to rise as sparks crackled through wires. What returned was not life but something colder, something borrowed. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The year was 1889, and the city of Prague carried itself in a hush of superstition. The narrow streets wound like veins through a body already filled with secrets, and behind shuttered windows men whispered of science that crossed boundaries never meant to be crossed. In the quarter near Vitava, where the river mist coiled each evening, there lived a physician whose name was uttered rarely and always with unease. Dr. Josef Nadek. He was not an old man, barely into his 40s when the rumors began, but he looked far older, with sunken eyes and hands marked by burns from glass and wire. His clinic by day was ordinary coughs, fevers, the endless parade of childhood ailment. Yet when darkness fell, the shutters closed and a glow not of candlelight but of something stranger leaked from beneath the doorframe. Nadek's neighbors reported odd sounds, the click of gears, the hum of coils, sometimes the thin, sharp squeal of what could only be animals in pain. A grocer's wife once claimed she saw him in the alley carrying a sack that writhed as if something inside struggled for breath. Her husband told her to forget it. People always told one another to forget, but the truth clung to him like a shadow. The first record we have is not from Prague itself, but from a small medical journal published in Vienna. An anonymous report describes a demonstration given in a dim lecture hall where Nadek produced a dead rat, stiff with rigor mortis, and placed it upon a copper plate. Before a dozen skeptical physicians, he attached slender wires to the animal's limbs and cranked a generator. At first the body convulsed, the sort of movement that galvanic currents always produced, but then, to the horror of the onlookers, the rat's eyes opened. Witnesses wrote of the sound it made, not a squeak but a rattling hiss, as though lungs without breath had been forced into motion. One doctor fainted. Another swore afterward that the creature stood on its hind legs for an instant before collapsing. Nadek said little, only noting that death is but a circuit interrupted. Word of this experiment spread quickly. Some called him visionary, more called him a blasphemer. But none doubted what they had seen. By the autumn of that year, his cellar laboratory had become an obsession. He filled it with copper coils, glass jars of clear liquid, and rows of cages. The rats came first, dozens, then hundreds. He bought them from street urchins, who learned to bring him whatever they trapped in alleys. The children joked that he was building an army of the dead, but their laughter faltered when they heard scratching from the sacks they delivered, long after the creatures within should have been stilled. Then came frogs, birds, even the occasional stray cat. Nadek's notes, fragments of which survived, described temporary awakenings. He observed reflexes, eye movements, the slow rise of breath, forced back into a chest that had ceased all motion hours before. He wrote with the precision of a surgeon, but also with a fervor that bordered on worship. The spark carries them over the threshold. They resist, but they return. Even in refusal they cannot help but obey. Death is not final. It is only reluctant. Neighbors began to avoid him. The butcher refused his coin. Children crossed the street when he passed, yet none dared confront him directly, for there was something unsettling in his gaze, an intensity that suggested he was already listening to voices they could not hear. The tension grew until the winter of 1889, when the city lay buried under snow and nights stretched long. On such a night, a servant girl named Anna Havel vanished from the household where she worked. Whispers soon tied her disappearance to Nadek. People claimed to see her entering his clinic carrying a bundle of linen, perhaps for cleaning, but never saw her leave. The police searched but found nothing. Still, suspicions festered, and then one February evening screams echoed through the courtyard outside Nadek's residence. Witnesses described a sound, not belonging to any living throat. When officers arrived, they found the doctor's cellar locked from within, candles extinguished but faint sparks dancing on the floorboards as though lightning had passed through the stones themselves. The door was broken open. Inside, the lab was in ruin, cages toppled, glass shattered, and the smell of ozone hung heavy in the air. Of the doctor there was no sign, only his notes remained, scattered, ink-stained, some half-burned as though he had tried to destroy them in haste. Those who read them afterwards swore they contained more than medical jargon. There were sketches of rats, yes, but also of human forms, nervous systems traced like maps, skulls marked with sigils, diagrams that blended anatomy with something older, something closer to ritual. One line, scrawled in a margin, chilled even the most skeptical. The rat is but the beginning. Flesh remembers. What rises in them will one day rise in us. The authorities sealed the laboratory, confiscated what they could, and dismissed the affair as madness. They told the newspapers that Nadek had fled, perhaps across the border to avoid debts, but those who had stood near the cellar door that night swore otherwise. They spoke of shadows that did not move with the candlelight, of a figure glimpsed among the wreckage, bent and twitching, yet vanishing when the lamps were raised. Some even claimed to hear scratching in the walls of the tenement long after the room was boarded. The landlord eventually abandoned the building entirely, and for decades it stood empty, windows shattered, until it was finally demolished. But even then the workmen spoke of nests of rats found beneath the floor, rats whose eyes glimmered strangely in the half-dark, as though lit from within. Closes with unease rather than revelation. We stand at the threshold of Nadek's obsession, his cellar laboratory still echoing with the screams that ended his work. What truly happened that night remains hidden, sealed in ash and ruin. But his notes, those fragments of madness, survived, and in them lies the path we must follow deeper into the shadows. For if he could stir a rat from its grave, even for a moment, then what greater horrors might he have prepared? The city of Prague is built upon layers of silence. Beneath its cobbled streets lie catacombs, hidden chambers, and forgotten wells, each carrying memories no one wishes to stir. It is here among the cracks and shadows that rumors take root and thrive. After the disappearance of Dr. Joseph Nadek, whispers about him spread through the taverns and marketplaces, carried in half-sentences, spoken too softly to be overheard, yet always reaching someone who would repeat them again. At first people dismissed him as merely eccentric, a physician who had let obsession consume him. But in the months following his vanishing, strange events began to surface, each one too peculiar to ignore. A washerwoman named Marta Dosek told of finding a rat near the riverbank, its body bloated with death. She swore that when she tried to kick it into the water, the creature twitched, rolled onto its side, and looked directly at her before falling still again. The story spread, embroidered with each retelling, until the rat became a grotesque messenger of Nadek's failed experiment. Then a clerk in the old town claimed that during a heavy snowstorm, he passed Nadek himself near the Charles Bridge. The doctor was hunched, his coat collar drawn high, but the clerk recognized his gait. Yet when he called out, the figure turned, revealing not a man's face, but something pale and swollen, with eyes shining faintly as though catching some inner flame. By morning the clerk had recanted, saying he had only dreamt it, though he refused to walk the bridge again after dark. The authorities, eager to quiet unrest, released a statement declaring Nadek's journals scientifically unsound, and his work a danger to public health. The words meant little. Most never believed their officials in the first place. Instead, it was the neighbors' accounts that mattered, and these grew stranger with each passing week. Children dared one another to creep to the boarded cellar where Nadek had worked. Some claimed to hear the faint crackle of electricity within, as though his machine still operated Others swore they heard scratching from beneath the planks, as if the earth itself were alive. One boy, a baker's son named Lucas, returned white as milk, unable to speak for days. When he finally did, he described hearing a woman's voice whisper his name from behind the door. He recognized the voice, he said. It was Anna Havel, the servant girl who had disappeared. At this point, the clergy stepped forward. The parish priest of St. Vitus, Father Khalil Borovsky, preached against the arrogance of men who think they can command the boundary between life and death. He declared Nadek's house cursed, and warned that anyone who lingered there risked damnation. Yet even Father Borovsky was not untouched by the tale. His diary, discovered long after his death, tells of a night when he himself ventured to the building with a flask of holy water. I went with the intent to cleanse what remained, he wrote, but when I placed my hand upon the boards, the wood was warm as flesh. Something inside shifted, and I felt a vibration, like the hum of a distant storm. I did not enter. God forgive me. I turned and fled. More fragments of Nadek's notebooks began to surface. A university student named Emil Kruger confessed to stealing several pages from the sealed cellar. Before it was boarded, he showed them to his professors, who dismissed them as delusions, but Kruger insisted otherwise. He later recorded in a letter, "It is not only galvanism. Nadek believed memory resides not in the brain alone, but in every thread of the flesh." He wrote that even in death, the tissue recalls its function, awaiting only the correct signal to resume. He drew diagrams suggesting that each muscle has a hidden memory, a will to return. If true, this is not revival of life as we know it. It is an imitation, a shadow compelled by force. Kruger was found drowned in the Fava 2 weeks later. The pages he had stolen were never recovered. The rumors were given a dreadful weight when a group of undertakers came forward with their own story. They claimed that during the spring of 1890, while preparing a pauper's grave, they unearthed a coffin already The wood was splintered from within, the lid broken as though the corpse had attempted escape. Inside lay the body of a man, long dead but unnaturally preserved. His veins bore faint black lines, not of decay but of something metallic, as though wires had once threaded his flesh. The undertakers refused to speak further, and demanded the coffin be reburied in consecrated ground. Everywhere in Prague, people began connecting deaths, disappearances, and inexplicable sightings to the doctor's forbidden work. Some swore the rats that infested the alleys were no longer ordinary vermin, but vessels of Nadek's experiments, their movements jerky, their eyes reflecting lamplight with unnatural clarity. Others whispered that he had succeeded with human subjects, that Anna Havel, the missing servant girl, had been his first attempt. One chilling tale told of a woman glimpsed in the Hradacini quarter, pale, staggering, clutching at walls as though unused to walk. Her mouth opened as if to scream, but only a rasp emerged, a sound like breath caught in a broken bellows. When passers-by approached, she fled into an alley and vanished. Days later, a shawl was found there, recognized by a fellow servant as belonging to Anna. Yet amid the fear and rumor, a few voices defended Nadek. A physician named Dr. Augustin Rozek argued in lectures that galvanism had genuine potential. He admitted Nadek may have gone too far but insisted that reanimation, even partial, was worthy of study. He reminded his colleagues that centuries earlier, men had called alchemists mad, and yet chemistry had grown from their madness. Perhaps, he suggested, Nadek was simply ahead of his time. Rozek's defense earned him ridicule, but privately, he began to receive letters, anonymous, written in a jagged hand. These letters hinted that Nadek's experiments were not finished, that his disappearance was no escape, but a transform. One letter ended with a line that Rozek burned immediately after reading. "The rats do not stay dead. Why should I?" By midsummer, the city had grown restless. The boarded cellar had become a site of pilgrimage for the curious, the fearful and the desperate alike. Some left offerings, candles, bread, scraps of cloth, as though appeasing a restless spirit. Others scrawled warnings on the boards, "Do not open." But children still dared each other to linger there at night, and more than once a passerby swore they saw the boards pulse outward, as though something pressed against them from within. The authorities finally ordered the building demolished. When workmen arrived, they found the cellar blackened, every stone charred as though touched by fire. Though no blaze had ever been reported, beneath the rubble, they uncovered fragments of machines, coils fused into slag, glass, twisted into grotesque shape, and among the debris one man claimed to discover a bone. It was small, like that of a child, but lined with something metallic. He dropped it and refused to touch it again. The remains were carted away and buried beyond the city limits, but the story did not end there. The night after the demolition, rats swarmed the street where the building had stood, hundreds of them, moving as though guided by a single will, circling the ruins until dawn. It was then that people began to say aloud what they had only whispered before, that Nadek had not died, nor fled, nor been erased. Instead, he had become part of his own experiment. His body, his knowledge, his very essence now lingered in the creatures he had raised, in the circuits of flesh and spark he had forced to obey. And if this were true, then Prague itself had become his labyrinth, with the city steeped in fear, its people haunted by the sense that Nadek's presence persisted. Each strange sighting, each rat that moved wrong in the shadows, each whisper of a pale figure, staggering through the fog, all pointed to a truth no one dared admit. The doctor's work was not contained to his cellar. It had spread, and the boundary between life and death was no longer secure. The city remembers in silence. Prague is a place where
it began with papers, tattered, water-stained, found where they should not have been.
A laundress, named Ivana Blaha, claimed that while mending coats for the garrison, she discovered a folded sheet tucked inside a lining. Written in Nadek's hand, it contained not a medical prescription, but a note that read, "Breath is memory. Touch the lung with current and it remembers to rise. Touch the heart and it longs to strike again." Authorities dismissed it as forgery, but others swore the ink was real. More scraps appeared under a pew in St. Nicholas Church, beneath the floorboards of a boarding house, slipped between the pages of an apothecary's ledger. They were always brief, always unsettling, always signed simply JNN. How had his writing spread so far? The answer came from a watchman named Otakar Radhisli, who confessed that after the demolition, he had taken several pages as curiosities. Fear gnawed at him. He told a priest that the pages moved when he was not looking, curling and uncurling like skin around a wound. One night, in terror, he threw them into the fine Teva. Days later, fishermen swore they found dead eels floating belly up, their bodies twitching as though charged by hidden lightning. The community itself began to split. Some believed Nadek's work was the devil's whisper, a violation of divine order. Others, often those who had lost children to cholera or men to the mines, wondered if perhaps there was hope buried in his madness. For grief will listen where reason will not. There was the case of Helena Vivera, a widow whose infant daughter died in winter. Neighbors swore she visited the ruins each night, pressing a tiny blanket against the boards, murmuring lullabies into the crack. Once, another woman followed her and saw the cloth twitch, as if a small hand reached from beneath. And in the Jewish quarter, an old scholar named Eliyahu Stern found within Nadek's notes a disturbing resemblance to ancient Kabbalistic texts. He argued that the doctor was not the first to believe flesh carried memory. In certain forbidden writings it was said that clay itself remembers the breath that shapes it, that bodies, whether of earth or of man, do not entirely forget. Nadek, Stern believed, had simply clothed this notion in wires and coils. One story preserved in the private journal of a pharmacist deserves mention here. In May of 1890, a patient entered his shop, pale, thin, eyes glazed. The man asked for laudanum but did not give his name. When the pharmacist reached for the bottle, he noticed something unsettling. The stranger's left hand shook violently, not with tremor but with spasms so sharp the fingers snapped against the counter. The pharmacist described the sound as like dry twigs breaking. Horrified, he looked closer and realized the flesh of the hand bore faint seams as though stitched from within. Before he could question further, the man seized the laudanum and fled. Days later, a body was found in an alley, drained of blood yet strangely preserved. The left hand was missing. By now, the police grew desperate to quell panic. They raided bookshops, searching for any mention of Nadek. Yet it was too late. The doctor had become a kind of ghost that moved through whispers, inhabiting journals, letters, and rumors. Children told stories of him at night, daring one another to knock on cellar doors. Merchants sold candles, claiming to ward off the dead doctor's wrath. And in taverns, old men swore they had heard scratching in the walls, followed by tiny voices muttering in a tongue no human mouth should form. But the most disturbing evidence came from a ledger kept by the city mortuary. Within, 2 attendants recorded incidents they dared not share aloud. One spoke of a corpse brought in from the river, a beggar drowned in spring thaw. When they prepared him for burial, his chest convulsed, a single gasp escaping his lips though the body had been lifeless for days. Both attendants swore they heard a faint hum like wire vibrating before the body stilled once more. Another entry written weeks later described a young woman found in the alleys near Nadek's old residence. She was dead, throat cut, but her eyes opened as they washed her. The attendants fled the room, and when they returned with others, her body was gone. The door had remained locked. These accounts suggest a pattern. Nadek's influence had escaped confinement. No longer was it limited to rats in his cellar. The very boundary between stillness and motion, silence and breath, seemed disturbed across the city. His writings described flesh as memory, and now it seemed Prague itself was remembering. Of course, there was skeptics. Professors at the university dismissed it all as mass hysteria. They said grief, fear, and rumor had conspired to create illusions. But if that was so, why did so many of their students vanish in those months? Why did their laboratories smell faintly of ozone long after experiments were complete? And why did rats, dissected and discarded, sometimes appear again in their cages, eyes staring, limbs stiff yet moving. The families of Prague carried these secrets quietly. A mother would whisper to her son never to walk by the river at night. A shopkeeper would bar his cellar door not against thieves but against scratching from beneath the floor. Priests found their confessionals filled with terrified murmurs. "Father, I heard my brother's voice, though he has been dead these 3 years." Some sought explanations beyond sight. They spoke of curses, of restless spirits, of Nadek's soul wandering unshriven, but those who had glimpsed his notes knew better. This was not the work of spirits, nor of demons. It was something colder, something mechanical, something born of obsession and calculation. One fragment of his journal found years later in a private collection says it plainly. The rat twitched, the frog opened its eyes, the bird gasped. They did not return of themselves. They returned because I commanded it, and what obeys once will obey again. Flesh is clay, I am the pot. By the end of that year, Prague was a city unsettled. The air itself seemed charged. At night candles burned strangely, their flames bending sideways as though stirred by invisible currents. People swore the cobblestones hummed beneath their feet, and always in the alleys the rats gathered in numbers too great to be natural, their eyes gleaming like sparks in the dark. Here, with the city caught between denial and dread, families whisper of Nadek in their kitchens, priests mutter prayers that falter on their tongues, and scraps of journals pass from hand to hand like contraband scripture. The doctor is gone, yet his presence thick. Prague itself has become his book, its streets his laboratory, its people unwilling participants in an experiment they cannot escape. And always the question remains, if rats, frogs and birds could be stirred from death, what of men and women? It is often said that families guard their secrets more tightly than their treasures. In Prague during the years following Nadek's disappearance, every household seemed to clutch one. The city was not only haunted by rumor, but also by what people had seen with their own eyes and dared not share. Yet secrets, like corpses, do not stay buried forever. One such account came from the Stadler family, who lived in a tenement near the old demolition site. For months after the cellar was destroyed, they complained of noises beneath their floorboards, soft scratching, followed by an unnatural stillness, and then a faint hum like wires vibrating. Herr Stadler, a cobbler, dismissed it as rat, but one night when the sound grew louder, his wife pulled up a loose plank. What she saw drove her to faint. Beneath the boards lay the small corpse of a rat, long dead and stiff, yet its limbs twitched in convulsions, sparks glimmering faintly in its fur. The family fled the apartment by dawn, leaving their possessions behind. More chilling still was the secret kept by the Havel household. They had once employed the servant girl Anna, the same girl rumored to have disappeared into Nadek's clinic. The Havels insisted for years that she had run away, yet in the winter of 1891, their youngest daughter, age 6, revealed otherwise. While feverish, she whispered to her mother, "Anna comes to my bed when the house is quiet. She stands and watches. Sometimes she strokes my hair. Her hands are cold." The parents dismissed it as delirium, but neighbors claimed they too had seen a pale figure near the windows at night. One neighbor, an elderly widow, swore she saw Anna's shawl trailing in the snow outside the Havel home, though no footprints marked the ground. The family never spoke of it again, but the daughter, grown many years later, confessed in a letter that she remembered the visits vividly. A woman standing silent in the shadows, lips parted as though about to speak, eyes reflecting a strange inner light. Other families carried their stories to the grave. In the Ledvina household, a boy died of scarlet fever. Weeks later, his sister claimed to hear him calling from the attic. At first they thought it was grief, but when the father climbed the stairs, he returned pale, carrying the boy's old shoe. They had been placed neatly side by side on the attic floor, though no one had gone up there in months. The family sealed the attic door with nails and never reopened it. The community secrets did not end in homes alone. The parish of St. Vitus found itself plagued by disturbance. Father Borowski, already shaken by his encounter with Nadek's boarded cellar, began to hear scratching beneath the church altar. He at first dismissed it as vermin, until one night while praying, he felt the floor tremble beneath his knees. Lifting a loose stone, he discovered a hollow chamber. Inside lay several rats, dead, but arranged deliberately in a circle, their bodies stiff yet glimmering faintly as if touched by sparks. Terrified, he sealed the stone again, but confided the event in his diary. It is not the rats themselves, but the arrangement. Someone, or something places them so. This is not decay. This is design. Nadek's hand still moves. Even the city's scholars began to whisper of odd happenings. One professor at Charles University, Henryk Novak, confessed to colleagues that his students reported seeing shadows moving independently of their owners in the anatomy halls. Another claimed that specimens in jars twitched when the lamps flickered. Novak himself recorded a chilling encounter. Late one night, as he prepared to leave, he noticed a cadaver on the dissection table had shifted position. The hands, which had been folded upon the chest, now hung over the edge. Convinced a student had played a cruel joke, he replaced them. Yet when he turned back moments later, the corpse's head had tilted, its eyes once closed open and staring. These accounts share one thread: secrecy. Families hid them, priests buried them in diaries, scholars muttered them only behind locked doors. To speak openly was to risk ridicule or worse, yet silence only fed the dread, and rumors spread faster than truth. In 1892, a pamphlet appeared anonymously across the city, slipped beneath doors and left on tavern tables. It bore no author's name, only the title, The Notes of the Dead Doctor. Within were fragments of Nadek's journals, copied by an unseen hand. The pamphlet claimed he had discovered a principle called resonant memory, that every cell carried within it the pattern of its life, and with the correct spark, it could be coaxed to It was not resurrection, the pamphlet said, but repetition. The body remembers, it declared, and memory itself is a form of obedience. The pamphlet ended with a chilling promise. He has not left us. He lingers in every rat that scratches, in every twitch of dead flesh. He waits for the right circuit to be complete. The city authorities seized as many copies as they could, burning them in the square, but not before the words had etched themselves into the minds of hundreds. What made matters worse was the discovery of a hidden ledger kept by undertakers in the Jewish quarter. Inside were notes of burial anomalies, bodies refusing decay, coffins disturbed from within, corpses whose eyes remained bright for weeks. One entry read, "Buried woman of 20 years, drowned, her skin cold but soft as though living, on third night after burial, ground disturbed. We dug coffin empty. This is not work of grave robbers. Soil was pressed from below, not a..." The ledger, when found, was locked in church archives, but whispers of its contents spread nonetheless. By now, even those who mocked the story of Nadek began to falter. Families refused to let their dead be buried near his old quarter, fearing contamination. Priests sprinkled holy water upon every coffin. Workmen carried charms when demolishing houses, certain that beneath the stones lay bones threaded with wires, and still the rats multiplied. Witnesses claimed they moved not as animals but as soldiers, darting in patterns, circling, gathering, dispersing at once. Some swore they formed shapes in the snow, as if spelling words. No one dared study them close. Science, when stripped of its reverence, is nothing more than curiosity sharpened into cruelty. Prague in the early 1890s proved this truth. Though the city tried to bury Nadek beneath rumor and rubble, his influence seeped upward, like damp through stone. What had begun as whispers in homes and secrets hidden in ledgers, now took root in the hands of men who should have known better: physicians, scholars, and the keepers of bodies. The first evidence comes from the records of the Charles University Anatomy Hall. Officially, dissections were routine, conducted under supervision, catalogued with precision, yet hidden among the neat pages of attendance lists and supply orders lies a set of marginal notes, ink darker, hand shakier. The notes describe cadavers that refused silence. One entry, dated October 1892, reads, "Subject, male, age approx 34, death by drowning, upon incision to chest cavity, movement observed in left arm." Students startled, assumed error in death record, rechecked body confirmed drowned, pulse absent, decay begun, yet arm continued to flex intermittently, as if striking at water unseen. The professor who recorded this, Dr. Henryk Novak, tried to dismiss it as muscular aftershock, but the following week, another entry appears, subject, female, 27, death by fever, upon opening cranial cavity, eyes flickered, witnessed by 6 students, flicker repeated thrice, though optic nerves severed, no explanation possible. It was here, in the sterile chill of dissection rooms, that Nadek's shadow pressed hardest. The students whispered of him constantly. Some mocked, others trembled, but all remembered his pamphlets, his scrawled notes,
the rumors of rats rising in sacks. These lingered over every cadaver like a second shroud. One student, Jiri Prochaska, took his curiosity further. He began to visit the mortuary after hours, bribing attendants with stolen coins. There, he conducted small experiments.
In his journal, later confiscated, he writes, applied current to thoracic region of subject, male, age 19, death by consumption. Expected contraction of chest. Observed instead shallow gasp, lips parted, sound produced. Students present fled. I alone remained. The sound repeated, weak but distinct, a word or shape of one, could not discern. I believe tissue recalled speech, as it recalls breath. Resonant memory confirmed. Such experiments did not remain confined to students. Physicians too could not resist. Dr. Augustin Rojek, who had once defended Nadek publicly, acquired fragments of his lost notes. He concealed them in a false bottom drawer, where decades later they would be found. The fragments include diagrams of circuits connected not only to limbs, but to spines, skulls, even tongues. Scribbled in margins are phrases that read less like science and more like command. They must rise. They must speak. What they utter will not be their own but mine. Rojek's private notebook betrays both fascination and terror. Nadek did not seek life. He sought obedience. Spark compels, not awakens. These are not resurrections but puppets of memory. To continue would be monstrous, yet I cannot stop. Evidence of continuation appears in the city's hospital records. Several nurses confessed, years later, to patients who died yet moved again. One case, a cholera victim, wrapped for burial, who sat upright on the gurney, eyes glazed. The nurses screamed. Orderlies restrained the body until it lay still once more. The incident was erased from official records, but rumors spread among staff. They began to mutter that the hospital itself had become infected, that its walls carried Nadek's spark. Another nurse described hearing coughing from the morgue late at night. When she opened the door, she found 3 covered corpses lying still, yet the sound had come from within the room. She resigned the next day. Meanwhile, families began reporting strange demands from undertakers. They asked to drive iron spikes through the chests of the deceased before burial. Officially, it was to prevent grave robbery. Unofficially, it was to keep bodies from rising. Some families refused, horrified. Others agreed, whispering prayers as the hammer fell. Those who resisted often returned weeks later with stories of disturbed graves. One chilling account survives from the Kohler family. Their grandmother died in spring of 8. They buried her without the spike. Days later, children playing in the yard claimed to see her at the fence, her dress muddy, her face pale but smiling faintly. When the father rushed out, she was gone. The grave was found half collapsed, the coffin lid cracked. That night the family consented to the undertaker's iron spike. Journals from these years show that the city itself was growing restless. Priests recorded exorcisms, not for spirits but for corpses that seemed unwilling to stay still. Physicians confessed privately that death certificates no longer felt certain. Mothers hushed their children when they coughed, not only fearing illness, but fearing what might come if illness carried them too far. One diary, belonging to a midwife named Sabina Holub, offers perhaps the most haunting testimony. She writes of attending a stillbirth. The infant lay motionless. The mother wailed, but then Sabina saw the child twitch. Its tiny hands clenched, unclenched, as though grasping at unseen threads. The mother screamed with hope, but the twitching ceased. Sabina never spoke of it aloud. She wrote only, "Nadek has touched even the unborn. His spark runs not only through corpses but through silence itself. Death is no longer certain. I fear to bring children into this city." By the mid-1890s, Prague had become a city of watchers. People no longer looked only at the living but at the dead, waiting for signs of movement. Corpses were burned more frequently. Funerals carried an air of terror, mourners hurrying through prayers as if afraid the body might interrupt. Rats thrived more than ever, their numbers so great that the streets at night seemed alive with a crawling carpet. In this atmosphere, a new rumor spread, that Nadek himself had not vanished but had become dispersed. His flesh, his essence, his mind perhaps, had bled into the very vermin he once raised. Some said if you stared too long into the eyes of a rat in Prague, you would glimpse a spark of human intelligence staring back. Others whispered that he had woven himself into the city's electrical lines, into every hum of a machine, every flicker of a lamp. The deeper one digs into the archives of Prague between 1893 and 1895, the more the pages resist. Whole files are missing, ledgers end mid-sentence, and in their place, there are whispers of a private collection, a body of writing hidden in plain sight. They called them the Black Journals. No one knows how many volumes once existed. Some claim 6, others 30. What remains are fragments, brittle pages, corners burned, margins stained with candle soot. They surface not in libraries but in attics, pawn shops, and the secret cupboards of doctors who dared not admit they possessed them. The handwriting is unmistakable, sharp, heavy strokes that cut across the page like incisions into flesh. Each entry reads less like a record and more like a confession. One passage dated April 1893 begins, "The rat rose, as always, its eyes filmed white. It clawed the table, then fell still, but the spark lingers. I am certain, the body remembers command. It is only the vessel that betrays me. I must find a vessel less weak." Another, "A boy's body was delivered to the hall. Consumption had stolen him early. I tested the coil. His chest rose, fell, once, twice, then the strangest thing. His lips formed a sound, not speech, but the shape of speech." The others screamed. I alone remained. I alone recorded. The journals reveal a shift in Nadek's obsession. Where once he sought resurrection, now he sought articulation. Movement was not enough. He wanted his subjects to speak, to remember, to carry words back from the silence. In one particularly disturbing entry, he describes binding copper filaments directly to the tongue of a cadaver. He records with clinical detachment. Upon current, the tongue convulses, the mouth opens, noise produced, a low moan, near to human. Repeated application yielded variation of pitch. If controlled correctly, one might shape vowels then words. They would not be the words of the subject, but the words I choose. The mouth as instrument, the spark as but. Here science had curdled into puppetry. He was no longer a physician but a conductor, turning the dead into instruments of sound. It was not long before others attempted to imitate him. One physician, Dr. Rojek, the same who once defended Nadek, was said to have conducted a parallel trial in the damp cellar of a hospital annex. His assistant later testified that they placed wires into the jaw of a fresh cadaver. When current was applied, the corpse let out a cry so sharp and childlike that the assistant fainted. Rojek, in a letter he never sent, wrote, "We have touched the veil not to pierce it, but to teach it song." Nadek was right. Memory is not in the mind but in the sea. What speaks is not soul but echo. Still, an echo is enough to terrify. The Black Journals also speak of disturbances during storms. Nadek writes that lighting seemed to feed his experiment. During one tempest in late summer 1893, he wired 3 rats to a single coil and opened the shutters to the sky. The lighting struck nearby, flooding the apparatus with raw current. He claims the rats stood upright in unison, their tiny jaws chattering as though speaking in chorus. The vision lasted only seconds before they collapsed, but Nadek insisted he had witnessed the first true choir of the reanimated. Witnesses nearby told of screams from the laboratory that did not sound like men, nor like animals, but like something caught between. But the journals grow darker still. They shift from rats to human cadavers taken illegally. Morgues reported missing bodies, undertakers discovered coffins, lightened, and families whispered of loved ones stolen from grave. Nadek does not name his sources, but the tone of his writing changes. The rats are too frail, the frogs too simple. Only man remembers with clarity. Only man, when sparked, returns speech. I do not steal, I reclaim what the earth would waste. In another, the subject fought me. His arms struck wildly when the spark entered. I bound him with straps. His eyes opened, wide, furious. He stared not at me but through me, as though he looked upon something behind. When the current ceased, he collapsed, yet his gaze lingered. I dread to close my own eyes, for I fear I shall see what he saw. There are notes too of unnatural endurance. One cadaver continued to breathe shallowly for nearly an hour after the current ended. Another retained heat in the chest, though all spark was withdrawn. Nadek began to question whether he was summoning life, or inviting something else entirely to inhabit these bodies. They do not return as themselves, he writes, nor as beasts. They return as vessels. The spark opens a door and something steps inside. I fear what I have allowed enter. Yet to stop now would be wasteful. I must continue. Those who later read the Black Journals often refused to describe them fully. One archivist, when pressed,
admitted that the most terrifying passages were not the ones of scientific detail, but the ones where Nadek spoke not to his readers but to his subjects. Whole pages begin with phrases like, "You will rise for me, you will not you belong to the current now." The archivist swore the handwriting itself seemed altered, as if written in haste, or by a hand less human. The journals also mention voices overheard during experiment. Nadek describes sounds that did not issue from the corpses, but from the walls, the rafters, even the ground beneath the floorboards, low murmurs, indistinct but rhythmic, rising whenever the coils were active. He dismissed them at first, as wind or electrical vibration, but then, in his final surviving entry, he confesses, "The voices call my name, not Doctor, not Nadek. They call me by the name my mother spoke, a name no living soul now remembers. How could they know this? I have not written it, I have not spoken, yet they whisper it, in unison, as if welcoming me home." That entry ends abruptly, the ink smeared as though the pen was torn from his hand. By the winter of 1894, Prague's whispers had hardened into conviction. The dead were not staying buried. Hospitals could no longer deny it, though their ledgers tried. Each week, another body was said to stir, to breathe, to twitch long after the physician's declaration of death. And though officials urged calm, their actions betrayed the truth. Iron spikes, heavier coffins, quicker burials, cremations in secret. But there was one place where the veil between life and death was not merely witnessed, it was cultivated. This place became known in rumor as the Hidden Ward. The Hidden Ward was not listed on hospital maps. Nurses knew its door only by the black wax seal that marked it shut to the public. Entry was granted to few, and even then,
control. That word appeared again and again. Nadek's influence had shifted the question. No longer should we, but how can we master it? One family, the Simics, provide the most harrowing tale of this era. Their daughter Clara died of scarlet fever. She was laid out in the parlor before burial. That night, as relatives prayed, her body convulsed, her eyes fluttered open. For a moment she smiled, though her lips were cracked and bloodless. She whispered something. Accounts differ whether it was mama or it hurt. The family screamed. By morning she was still again. They buried her in secret, without a priest, terrified that even God had abandoned them. And always there were the rats, reports of them swarming near the ward, gnawing through wooden doors, nesting beneath tables. Some claimed the rats grew bolder when the currents ran, watching from corners, their eyes reflecting the candlelight like tiny sparks. Others swore the rats no longer squeaked, but made sounds closer to whispers. Nadek's name returned to every rumor. People said he lived inside the rats, guiding them, watching through their eyes. Some even claimed to see him thin, pale, hunched, moving through alleys at night, followed by a tide of vermin. But whenever approached, he vanished, leaving only the stench of ozone and decay. By the end of 1894, Prague no longer trusted its own breath. The city was a body in suspense, half alive, half dead. Funerals were hurried, the bells tolling like warnings. Hospitals filled not only with the sick, but with the terrified. And beneath it all, in the hidden ward, the experiments continued. History calls it a storm. The records speak of thunder, winds that bent the trees along the Vltava, rain that lashed the gas lamps until they hissed. But the people of Prague do not remember a storm. They remember the night the dead would not stay still. It began on a November evening in 8. Candles were lit in chapels for the Feast of All Souls. The hidden ward had been braced with iron bars, its doors bolted, its experiments temporarily halted under orders from the council. And yet as lightning broke the sky, the bars themselves shuddered. The locks sprang and the lamps inside flared with unnatural brilliance. Nurses later whispered that every body on the tables sat upright at once, their jaws opened as if gasping for air, though no lungs filled. The sound that followed was not a cry nor a word, but the shattering of every glass vessel in the ward, beakers, tubes, jars bursting outward in one unison note. The city felt it. In homes along the river, mirrors cracked without being touched. Windows rattled until panes split. One diary entry belonging to Magdalena Krupka captures the dread. The glass in our cupboard screamed. As it broke, not shattered, screamed. I ran to the street. All around the same sound. Neighbors stood pale, holding shards in their hands. From St. Nicholas Tower came a ringing not of bells but of something struck from inside. That same hour in the Clementinum library, scholars recorded their own terror. A witness wrote. Books fell from shelves. The great clock stopped. Worse, the air filled with a stench like singed foot. In the silence after, we heard scratching, not of mice but of fingernails on stone. It came from beneath the floor. Meanwhile the rats swarmed. Witnesses swore that thousands poured from the drains, not fleeing but converged. They gathered in squares, clambering over one another in great writhing mounds. Their eyes glowed faintly in the storm's lightning, and some claimed the creatures stood upright, chittering like voices. Children cried that they saw faces in the swarm, human mouths opening and closing within the mass of fur. The hospitals bore the worst. Patients reported hearing their own names whispered from the morgue below. Some screamed that shadows pressed against their windows from the inside. One physician, Dr. Smith, fled into the rain, babbling that the bodies have remembered how to breathe. In the chaos, the hidden ward became a furnace of light. The wires sparked without current. The corpses convulsed in rhythm, and above them, above the crackle of storm and the chittering of rats, rose a chorus of voices, speaking not one language but many, Latin, German, Czech, Polish, all at once, as if Prague itself had gathered every tongue of its dead and loosed them together. Nurse Aliska, who survived that night, described it as the dead did not rise to walk. They rose to sing, but what they sang was not song, it was hunger given sound. Across the city, families fled cemeteries. Graves were seen collapsing, not from flooding but from within. Some swore they saw hands break through the earth before vanishing again. Priests knelt in mud, praying louder than the thunder, but their prayers were drowned out by the voices that echoed in every street. One carriage driver refused to return to the city after witnessing what he called a funeral in He saw a procession of figures, pale and dripping, moving not toward the graveyard but away from it, toward the heart of Prague. And then the lights failed, gas lamps extinguished, candles snuffed as though blown by unseen lips. Darkness swept the streets, broken only by lightning. In that void the voices grew louder, closer. Some whispered, others screamed. A few, it is said, laughed. Witnesses spoke of seeing Nadek himself at the center of it all, standing at a window of the hidden ward, his face pale as parchment, his eyes alight with spark. He raised his hands, and the chorus rose with him, but when the lightning struck the ward directly, the window shattered, and his figure was gone. By dawn silence returned, the rats dispersed, the dead lay still once more, broken glass littered every street. Funerals were hurried for bodies found half-burned in their coffins. Officials blamed the storm, dismissing all else as hysteria, but the people of Prague knew better. For weeks after, they reported seeing reflections that did not match their bodies. Children refused to sleep near mirrors. Women covered windows with cloth. Men swore they heard scratching in their walls though no rat appeared. The dead had not risen to stay, but they had made their presence known. The storm passed, but its echo clung to Prague like mildew. In the weeks after, silence became more frightening than sound. Churches overflowed, yet prayers carried the tremor of futility. Families shuttered their windows, not against thieves, but against the reflection of their own eyes in the glass. And beneath it all, whispers hardened into one conviction. Dr. Jan Nadek had not vanished. He had been claimed. The testimony of Dr. Rozek, among the most damning pieces of evidence, comes from Dr. Augustin Rozek, once Nadek's colleague, later his unwilling chronicler. Found decades later in his locked trunk was a sealed statement, never published in his lifetime. On the night of the storm I entered the ward against my better judgment. I saw the bodies not merely stirred, but animated with a will not their own. They moved in unison like puppets drawn by strings of fire, and there standing among them was Nadek. Yet he did not control them, he was bound with them, his flesh quivering in the same rhythm, his eyes vacant. He mouthed words not of his own language but of many tongues, layered, discordant. He was both conductor and instrument. Rozek insists Nadek had crossed a threshold. The spark he once wielded had ceased to be his tool. It had become his master. The theory of resonant memory reversed. The black journals spoke of resonant memory, the idea that tissues recall that the dead remember fragments of motion, sound, or command. But Part 9 reveals the inversion. It was not the bodies remembering them, it was something else remembering them. Fragments from Nadek's final notes read, "The spark is not life, it is invitation. The body becomes a door. Memory returns because memory was never theirs. It was always waiting beyond, seeking What had stirred in the rats, in the infants, in the cadavers was not the return of what was lost. It was the arrival of what was waiting." The scribe of the dead. One of the most chilling accounts survives from the diary of Magdalena Krupka, the same woman whose cupboards of glass had shattered. Weeks later she wrote, "I heard my name spoken as I slept. It was my father's voice, though he has been dead these 10 years. When I turned I saw not him, but a shape thin and white, wires trailing from its hands. It called me daughter. I fled, yet I feel it writes me even now as though my life is ink on its page." This image of the dead as scribes writing themselves through the living appears repeated. People claimed their thoughts were no longer private, that their very words were dictated from somewhere beyond. The council's last order. Panicked, the city council issued a secret decree. Every remaining coil, every journal, every wire connected to Nadek's experiments was to be seized and burned. Crematoria worked night and day, not for corpses alone but for papers, diagrams, even scraps of cloth thought to bear his touch. Witnesses reported a column of smoke rising for days, a stench of scorched hair and copper, but not everything was destroyed. Some physicians kept fragments, some families buried journals with their dead, and others whispered that burning was not destruction at all, that the fire only set Nadek free. The vanishing of Nadek. The most haunting detail: Nadek's body was never recovered. The storm broke the ward, shattered the glass, burned the papers, but no corpse of the doctor was found. Some believed he escaped, others believed he was consumed by his own choir of dead. But the most enduring belief was stranger still, that Nadek had that he was no longer one man but many, that he lived in the twitch of a rat's whisker, the flicker of a lamp, the sudden shiver in a mourner's breath. One priest, Father Kovar, wrote, "We do not bury Nadek because we cannot. He has no grave. He is the grave. Each coffin we close is another door he may open. Each spark of light in the night is his eye." The covenant. The people began to speak of a covenant, not of faith but of survival. They buried their dead with iron. They salted their windows. They prayed less for salvation than for silence, and in their silence they made an unspoken pact. Nadek would not be spoken of by name, for to speak was to invite. Yet here in the hidden manuscripts, the name endures, written again and again as if to ensure he is never forgotten, for forgetting too is a kind of invitation. Prague slept uneasily for years after the storm, even when streets filled again, when music returned to taverns, when bells rang without interruption. A hush lingered beneath. It was not peace but repression. The citizens learned to live around the silence, much as one learns to live beside a graveyard. Those who remembered whispered that the ward never healed. Its windows, once repaired, cracked anew without cause. Grass grew twisted in its courtyard. Candles refused to burn steady in its chapel. To pass by at dusk was to hear a faint scratching like claws on stone or pens writing without hands. The aftermath of the black journals. The council claimed all of Nadek's writings were destroyed, yet scattered copies surface even now. Marginalia in university libraries bear his strange glyphs. In London, a letter from 1903 mentions the Prague method of reanimation. In Paris, a medical thesis footnotes Nadek's galvanic surge as though it were common knowledge. What was meant to be erased instead became ideas whispered in corridors, passed hand to hand, never fully dying. Some say experiments continued in basements far from law and scripture, and each time a wire sparked across dead flesh, a door cracked open a little wide. Families that never recovered. The Krupkas moved away, yet their descendants speak of sleepless nights, of whispers calling their names in empty rooms. The Seska families sold their home, only to have buyers flee within months, claiming the air tasted like blood. And the nurses of the ward, those who survived, died in peculiar ways, found with their mouths open as if mid-scream, but lungs filled with water though no water was near. It was said, once Nadek touched your life he never let go. Science carries the stain. Modern science has tried to bury the tale under words like anecdote and folklore, yet in quiet moments, certain physicians admit that galvanism, tissue memory and electrical animation remain fields of fascination. Some even confess to repeating his experiments in secret, for if death is truly a door,
Who can resist knocking? The lingering dread. And so we come to the end, or rather to the place where endings are supposed to live. But with Nadek there is no grave, no stone, no sign, only the echo of the spark. When storms gather over Prague, the lightning does not simply strike, it lingers, like fingers on a wound. Old men claim they see shapes in the flash. A pale doctor, eyes hollow, lips moving. Rats still twitch in alleys when thunder rolls. Candles flicker not from drafts but from a breath that belongs to no living man. One final passage, found on the torn edge of his last notebook, reads, "Do not fear the silence after death. Fear the voice that calls your name within. Perhaps tonight as you sit in darkness you will hear it too. A faint scratching, a spark, a voice you swore belonged to the dead. If you do, do not answer, for the doctor is still listening, and the door is never fully closed."